for joining us on a special edition of the Comics Pals. We promised you guys that we would be hitting you with an overview of Watchmen, and that's what we're here to do today. We're looking at Watchmen across the original, the Alan Moore, Dave Gibbons classic, and then its two splinters, which are HBO's Watchmen, primarily by Damon Lindelof and everybody else, and Doomsday Clock, which of course is by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank. Now, I'm joined by the pals, of course. We're all here, and we poured over those three pieces of content to see how they overlap, what Damon's and Jeff's versions got right and wrong about the original and how they kind of extrapolate from it, and kind of where we land as far as what we like and what we don't. Up front, we omitted Before Watchmen from this for time purposes, and I mean there's just so much of that, and down the road we'll probably get to it, but for now this is going to be our sort of statement on all the Watchmen content that's been released aside from Before Watchmen. So I want to start this by letting you guys know that you can find us all over the internet at the Comics Pals. If you have thoughts about Watchmen that you want to share with us, you can do so by writing to us at thecomicspals@gmail.com. Of course, on social media, you can get us at the Comics Pals. And if you're watching this on YouTube, hi, you can leave us a like, drop us a comment, subscribe to our channel, share this video with your friends. All of those things are free to do, and they help us out a lot more than they cost you, and we really appreciate it. So I want to start this by getting the thoughts of the two individuals on this show who were not present ever for a review of HBO's Watchmen, which would be Pete and Phil. Kale and Marco and myself did a show called We Watched Watchmen. There are 9 episodes of that out right now that you can check out if you want our full thoughts. We will talk about our thoughts on the show as they relate to this conversation, but for the most part, if you want to hear our in-depth thoughts, go over there. And if you want our full in-depth thoughts of the Watchmen comic book, the original, we've got a book club for you for that. So why don't we start with Pete? What are your thoughts on HBO's Watchmen?
So I really enjoyed the show, and I edited We Watched Watchmen, so I definitely got a sense from you guys that it was going to be of high quality. So I went in with higher expectations than I probably would have if I just watched the first episode in real time. And I was happy to find that I agreed with your reviews of it, because I think it serves as a really good follow-up to Watchmen, because I think it has connective tissue and connection to kind of the legacy characters in a way that feels authentic versus like fan servicey. It's always in service of the plot, not in service of you as a fan of Watchmen, And I think its decision to like truly move forward and have a lot of the focus be on new characters that we didn't know, or very different versions of characters that we did know, was to its benefit. And I think it had a number of, pretty like really, really well executed storylines. I think the only one that lagged for me, which seemed to be the same for you guys, was kind of Adrian's. I like his overall role in the plot, but his whole dalliances on the moon of Jupiter were, I think, they spent a lot of time on it that I would have rather spent with all of the other stuff that was going on, because it was so well executed. And I do have not necessarily criticisms, but definitely a few takes on it that we'll develop more in this conversation. But overall, high praise for me. I think it's a must watch for sure.
Phil?
It was good. I think there were ideas that were really well executed that I really appreciated. So my kind of greater impression here was, I like that it felt like Damon Lindelof took the intent of what Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons were trying to do with Watchmen and apply it to a television show. I felt like in a lot of ways that they were trying to do a deconstruction of the comic book medium there was I had a sense with the main story arc of like a deconstruction of film and TV that I really appreciated. However, I felt that a lot of the actual Watchmen stuff felt tacked on or not well developed. Um, like the stuff with like the Minutemen was excellent. Like I liked how that unfolded, but when it actually came to stuff involving like Doctor Manhattan or Ozymandias, I felt like, which is how the second half of the show really the direction it goes. I felt like it was a little less inspired, but everything involving primarily new characters or taking less fleshed out things from the Watchmen book and weaving those into new ideas were really good.
Interesting.
So I think all in all it was good, and I liked the macro intent because Watchmen is mostly a book of ideas, and I think that's what the show was too. And I like that it was ambitious too.
Phil, you're all roboted out for us.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You guys are all normal for me.
All right, there you go. You're all right now. You want to just restate what you just said right there? Hold on 1 second.
God.
Let me make it a note. Okay, 750. Go ahead.
I said a lot.
Just that last part.
Yeah,
just the very last part.
Oh. Okay. I said
Overall,
I think Watchmen the book is a book of ideas and abstractions, and I think that's what the show was as well. I think it had a lot of ambitious ideas that I really appreciated. It tried things, and even if I don't think it was it, even if I had the impression that maybe it didn't work super well cohesively over 9 episodes, I like that they tried things in a way that we'll talk about later when we juxtapose the other Watchmen stuff. But it in an era where I feel like so much media is safe, I felt like the show really wanted to try something different.
Okay, cool. So, keep that in mind as we go forward. We're going to talk about the show a lot more. And by the way, if you haven't watched the show for whatever reason, A, do it. B, you will be spoiled 110%.
Yeah.
If you continue to listen.
Will be spoiled.
Yeah. Also, of course, with Doomsday Clock and the original Watchmen, if you still haven't read that somehow. So I think that the 3 Watchmen stories that we're looking at here are all sort of similar, but Doomsday Clock and HBO's Watchmen, they take what Watchmen did best, which was throwing the rules out the window, and they try to tell a cohesive, strong narrative about something very specific within that. And that is something that's very hard to do. Phil made mention of the fact that the show tries to be different. And even if it doesn't always succeed, at least it's not, the same old stuff.
Yes.
So I really want to start the conversation by talking about what it is that Doomsday Clock and HBO's Watchmen take from the original and how those things that they take inform the story. And I think that the real apex point from which you can see that both borrow the most is in what Ozzy does. It's in Ozzy's plan, because Ozzy's plan is basically the driving factor of the original Watchmen. And both Doomsday Clock and the show make specific points to make what he did very important moving forward. Which do you think did that better?
Before we get to that question, I think it's also interesting that in Doomsday Clock, I think you could say overall Ozzy's plan fails whereas in the show, I think it succeeds.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
definitely. So, I think my answer to this is kind of the primary point I want to bring up when juxtaposing the show versus Doomsday Clock, which is I think that the show does it better because it feels more integral to the plot. I think in Doomsday Clock, the it almost feels like that event is just the inciting excuse to set up the story that Johns wanted to tell. Whereas I feel like the show is more interested in exploring how, because obviously, right, if the plan fails and the world ends, there's no more story left in that universe. Whereas this is really interested in exploring the ramifications of not only his plan, but also the actions of characters like Dr. Manhattan and how that leads to Vietnam becoming the 51st state, and that influences the overall plot and how it arcs in a way more direct way than what Doomsday Clock does. And I think Doomsday Clock does a better job of feeling like Watchmen in the way of art, whereas I think the the show does a better job of trying to pull on the threads that were established in the original and take them to not necessarily like logical endpoints, but to really try to flesh out the world beyond just what was already there.
I think to that there's also something to be said about how grand each sort of sequel takes the Ozymandias sort of message. So as much as they sort of in Doomsday Clock find out the truth, the story continues to compound into an even larger sort of event. So I do agree that it is sort of an inciting moment for Doomsday Clock, but I think it's important just because it also carries continues to carry that grandiose plan. Like Ozymandias is still sort of the central character who is trying to still find this larger out there way to save essentially the universe, or at least his Earth. Whereas the show takes it to like a much more micro level, which is I think to me was more effective from a story perspective because to your point, Kale, they in the show Ozymandias' plan succeeds. So I think because they take it into two different directions, it also provides context for where from there the story continues to go.
I think in the show, uh, what it does really well is because Ozzy's plan succeeds, it gives us a world that we don't know, and it allows itself to it allows the people who made the show to build the world around that. Whereas Doomsday Clock really it brought the Watchmen characters and ideas to a world we already know and tried to make them fit that mold, or the ideas of that world fit the Watchmen mold.
And who are comparatively in a similar situation as what had been happening in Watchmen.
I think the intent from creative was different ultimately. I think
Yeah.
Jeff Johns was trying to tell a more meta textual story about comic books, juxtaposing a deconstruction with something more straight faced. Whereas I think here with the television show, I think he was trying. I think Lindelof was trying to make parallels between the context that the Watchmen book came out with how I feel like he doesn't think. Okay, so Watchmen was written at the height of, or at the tail end of the Cold War when people were still thinking that imminent nuclear winter was going to take place between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the world that has actually emerged since then is a world where there's a lot of thawing of geopolitical conflict. There is no threat of thermonuclear war across the planet anymore, really, and that's true in the show as well. So Ozzy effectively did create a world peace environment, but in the real world, without needing a giant alien, the world doesn't look dissimilar from the world that Damon Lindelof is created in the Watchmen TV show. Instead of having to worry about, the Russians or whatever, it's more about trauma of culture, which is what we're dealing with in the real world now. The United States isn't dealing with as much as some people want to paint actual geopolitical adversaries. It's more about our own past that we're confronting as a country, and that's what happens here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really how the show diverges the most from either one of them, because the show takes an angle that the original Watchmen doesn't really address, which is race and the ways that culture have impacted our society and where we're at. And obviously that was a very different time, and those things were more under the surface, and there were more, I mean, I don't want to say this dismissively, but there were more pressing matters at the forefront of most people's minds. So the thing that both Doomsday Clock and HBO's Watchmen do is they give us a character who represents the human cost of Ozzy's saving the world. So in the show, we get Looking Glass, and then in the comic, we get Reggie, the new Rorschach. And both of them are tormented by what Ozzy did. Both of them were either in proximity to it or they outright witnessed it, and their lives have been irreparably altered by this horrific event that takes place. And I love both of these new characters, and I think that they add a necessary wrinkle that the original Watchmen was never able to really address, which was, okay, cool, yeah, so you saved the world. I guess in Doomsday Clock he really kind of didn't, but just in the original Watchmen, you save the world, but how are people going to live after this? And the answer in both cases is that they're not, because in the comic, Doomsday Clock, everyone literally dies, like the world ends, and in the show, people are still alive, but people who, like, millions and millions and millions of people are affected by what was done, and millions, like other millions, just died outright. So it was a horrible thing. And it's easy to, and I want to hear what you guys have to say about this. We moralized on both sides when we did the review of Watchmen, and we talked about whether or not it was worth doing, what Ozzy's choice. And both of these futures, these splinter timelines, offer us a look at what could have happened if Watchmen had continued. And both of us show that in one way or another, it wasn't right. For people, it didn't work out so great.
So to respond to that, I definitely agree with you, because I think it's clear that that's one of the themes, right? But I also think it's hard to argue with what Kale said, in that I do look at the Watchmen, HBO's Watchmen, as an example of a success from Ozzy's actions, because I think looking at Doomsday Clock, I think it's clear that the world probably would have just ended, right? Had he not intervened and orchestrated his master plan. And I wouldn't argue that it was good or the right thing to do necessarily, but you also look in, like, the world is still alive and lots of people are experiencing trauma from it, and there are a lot of ramifications, both like the human cost of life and how it affected the world's society. but I think you can't argue that like any world event like that, any mass catastrophe, any geopolitical event like that is going to have that effect to some degree. And if the alternative is nuclear winter and the end of life on Earth, then I would say that it was a success, but that doesn't make Ozzy a good guy or make it like the right thing to do. He played God and gambled, and it happened to work out okay, you know. But to your point, Doomsday Clock shows a very different scenario where the world ends anyway.
I think one thing that's interesting, and especially when you compare these two specific characters, is that they're basically Rorschach clones.
Yeah.
Looking Glass has the mirror-esque mask, whereas
Right.
Reggie wears the actual Rorschach mask.
And it's funny because at the end of HBO's Watchmen, Looking Glass does put on a Rorschach mask.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
there's
That's
also-
right.
I think there's the clear mirroring of the fact that that is where he's more comfortable with that face. You know, like when he's at home alone, relaxing, that's what he's wearing. You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Referring to
Looking Glass.
Looking Glass.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but the thing to keep in mind there is that he does that because of how traumatized he is
Yeah.
Right.
by what he
Right,
by what
yeah,
happened.
of course.
He's constantly reflecting everything off. It's like very overt symbolism. The other thing that really drives home the Rorschach analogy is him like sitting in his bunker eating beans with the mask half off his face.
Yeah.
This kind of stuff Walter Kovacs actually did in Watchmen.
Right.
Kale, you were driving somewhere, weren't you?
I was, but I don't remember where I was. What was the question?
We were just looking at those two characters and how they were impacted by Ozzy's decision making. But if you can't remember, I'm going to respond to what Pete said.
Yeah,
because
sure.
I think that the show. Okay, so you guys said that the show represents a successful future for Ozzy's choice, and I think that's an interesting way to look at it, because several characters talk about how the world has stopped moving.
Yeah.
If you look at them technologically, they don't have what we even have now.
Yep.
And they're on the same track.
Ladies, Night Sister's using a fucking pager.
Right.
Yeah.
They don't even have cell
Yeah.
phones. They don't have the internet. It doesn't exist. So they're stuck. They have the same president that they had way back then. Nothing has moved forward. Clearly, race relations have not moved forward. They're still dealing with the same stuff as they were before. They just took away the threat of the end of the world. Even Ozzy, who was successful, is stuck. He's frozen because no one knows what he even did. And if they did, Doomsday Clock happens.
Right.
So it's kind of an interesting thing because, yeah, the world kept turning, but even at the end of the book, and I specifically want you to respond to this, Pete, at the end of not the book, but the show, when Ozzy is captured and Laurie kind of says, "Hey, man, you got to go to jail too, dude. You killed 2 million people." And he's like, "Well, what are you going to do? Arrest the president?" She's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Okay, so then the world is just going to end because people are going to go back to where they were. We're still there." And she's like, "Well, everyone says that. We might as well just see what happens."
Yeah. And that's exactly where I feel like the show really succeeded in, like, the message is like, it doesn't matter the shitty situation, it doesn't necessarily matter what happens, one or the other is going to happen, and there isn't really anything that anybody can do to stop either scenario. So taking the chance is taking the chance, but it's always a crapshoot, right? You could not have done that and found peace, but that's still a crapshoot. It doesn't matter. That's what I liked about that. And the reason I consider it a success, to Pete's point, is that at the end of the day, the world continued to turn, but the people who are dealing with the trauma, I mean, you have the the understanding that that world's going to continue going, right? To Lori's point. So the people who are affected by that trauma, we're just looking at it at post X number of years, but you push that forward X number of years, the world continues to move. It doesn't stop and mourn for anything. Like the fall of Rome doesn't affect us today. The same way this won't affect us 300 years from now, assumingly because the world continues to turn.
Yeah, the events in the Watchmen universe at the beginning of Doomsday Clock I think, are 5 or 6 years after Alien Day, V Day, whatever they're calling it, whatever they call it. But the show is 20 or 30. It's now,
right,
compared to when Watchmen came out.
And also push back on that. The other aspect is there are characters who very deliberately push back on Adrian. Like Lady True, her whole thing is like, you didn't go far enough.
Yeah.
Like, we didn't fix everything.
Right.
All the problems we have in this planet, like, you didn't fix anything, really.
Well, and I guess to respond to the question that you posed, Sean, is I definitely agree with what Marco's putting down, where the fact that, you know, even if right after this the world goes to shit and everything, it still lasted for 30 years. Like that's, you know, that's it extended the timeline long enough for a character like Lady True to come forward, you know, or in universe, a person like her to come forward, to be born and actually, you know, be someone who has a bigger vision for fixing the world. And granted, you know, she is kind of a megalomaniac and not necessarily the person to do that, but like the clone of her mother, Bien, like seems to be like a, you know, a more grounded person with a similar level of intelligence, and maybe she's the one to save the world in, you know, another few years or whatever, you know.
Pete, you've activated my trap card.
Oh,
Quickly, before we do that,
Go
one
ahead.
more thing about the Rorschachs. They also, in both versions, get their form of justice.
Yep.
Looking Glass arrests Adrian with Laurie, and Reggie saves Adrian before he can actually die so that he will face justice.
Right. And I love that in both versions, that's his future. That's Adrian will face justice for his crimes.
It sort of goes to show that I think maybe the overall message is, in that particular moment, maybe Rorschach was onto something.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I was going to respond to Pete with is a quote, actually, from the end of issue 8 of Watchmen. And it is by H.L. Mencken, and it is, "The urge to save humanity is almost always a false front for the urge to rule." Now, we see that Ozzy, in every timeline, will always try to save humanity from itself. Lady True also tries to save humanity from itself. So does Senator Keene. He thinks he has the solution. Obviously, he's a white supremacist, but in his mind, he's got to figure it out. All of those people will fail. We know that because of this quote. Like, obviously, the quote is not the Bible. It's not what's informing all of this, but it is I would say it's a truth that these characters, in their nature, their desire to save humanity is 1-to-1 with their desire to also rule humanity. Ozzy is mad because he doesn't get recognition for what he chose to do. If Robert Redford works with him, Ozzy rules humanity from behind the scenes. If Lady True is successful and she becomes Dr. Manhattan, what Ozzy said happens. She will rule, but everyone will have to pay the price for her doing the quote-unquote right thing. So my thought in response is, if you are granted, 30 years of extra life before the world then goes back to where it was before, and now we're faced with nuclear holocaust again, was it worth delaying the inevitable instead of letting the natural course of action play itself out and see what happens?
My response to that would definitely be, like, as a 27-year-old, yeah. I mean, I would rather live at all than have never existed.
That's
The-
extremely selfish because
The difference 3 years will make, man. Let me tell you.
Well, that's when the world ends, so that's perfect.
that's an extremely selfish point of view because there's millions of people that you are subjecting to torment because you feel like living another 30
I mean,
years.
it's billions of people who die though.
But
you know,
They're gonna die anyways.
to that point though, Sean, the natural course of the world is exactly that. Like it's not a choice between the natural course of the world or Holocaust. That very much is the natural course, regardless of what you do. It goes back to the thing is it doesn't matter what you do; it's a crapshoot either way.
yeah. And I would say to respond to that is, that's like that's the struggle of all living creatures, right? I mean, if your attitude is that like we're all gonna die eventually, so why not try to survive? Like that's the struggle of the species, you know. Like every living creature does that. Every living creature fights to survive and to breathe as many breaths as you can steal away before you get stuck back in the ground, you know.
But that's your choice as an individual person. You don't make that decision for millions and millions of other people. In fact, we're not even talking about allowing people to live or die only. We're talking about allowing people to live, millions and millions of people, allowing them to live in an extreme amount of pain and distress because of something that you chose to do versus allowing what's going to happen.
I didn't argue that he was right to do it. I said that it was a successful outcome for what he did.
But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what you just said, which was the struggle of humanity to continue to live on. And I'm saying that a choice was made to force people to live that way in extreme distress just because of Ozzy's desire not to live, but to rule, to be the one to have saved humanity. That's a different thing. Now, in addition to that, there's a juxtaposition that only the show makes. And this is why I think the show is so amazing, is the juxtaposition between this catastrophic event that Ozzy causes and the Tulsa race war. Now, both of those events cause generational trauma, which is what the show is about. And you can see, based on what happens to the black people that we are confronted with on the show, that was a terrible thing that had 100 years worth of baggage. Will Reeves was there, and he's still not over it.
Yeah.
Will Reeves' line is still dealing with this problem. And the implication is that black people are dealing with this problem. And in the real world, we don't need the show to tell us. We know that that's true. So in my mind, those are two things that can be clearly juxtaposed with one another. And I thought that was a really interesting and smart decision on the part of Damon and the crew.
Yeah, I mean, I think that theme of generational trauma is the thing that's probably the most well realized. You know, it's like that really is the thread between everything, and it weaves through not just the plots of the new characters, but also how it ties to the legacy. And I think to the point you made before, right? Like the entire through line of Hooded Justice's narrative through this entire story is like such a good anchor for like establishing that theme of how, you know, like to your point, like the Tulsa race war is essentially the inciting incident for the culture of superheroes. You know, like all of the events of Watchmen, you can argue go back to that moment. Like that moment creates Hooded Justice, which creates Ozymandias.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And to further extrapolate, Will Reeves is the Watchmen universe's Superman.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
To make that pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. There are, you know, allegories and everything all over the place with that. And I actually feel, well, I make no bones about this. Will Reeves is my favorite Watchmen character. I think he is the only hero that exists in all of Watchmen.
Nah, Lady True.
Oh, of course.
Here we go.
But
This is
I
why
will
Marco could never rule the world.
I
Oh.
will say to the point of like it's interesting that Will Reeves is your favorite character, because I think what both books do, and I'm sure we'll get into this, they both build out characters that fill the world that we all, I think, enjoyed, regardless of it being the show or it being the comic.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
definitely.
I think that was one of the things that they got right. Uh,
In both.
was yeah, in both
Yeah.
was the ability to introduce new characters that don't feel like you know how like when you get a season 2 of something and it's all these new characters and you're like, I just want the old characters back.
Right.
Yeah.
I never really felt like that. Did
No.
anyone feel like that?
No,
Mhm.
definitely not. I think the decision to acknowledge that Watchmen is a book about legacy, and that for you to make a proper follow up to Watchmen, there has to be legacy, you know, and whether it's Rorschach #2 in Doomsday Clock or if it's the Seventh Cavalry, you know, like seeing how heroes' actions, and I say heroes in quotes, actions echo through the world is what Watchmen is about, you know, and the fact that I think at the end of the day, kind of the central theme of Watchmen is that hero worship is bad, you know, and that like there are really not that like we put people on a pedestal and that there's a lot that we don't know about them, you know.
That's true, but what's interesting, so definitely in the original Watchmen, uh, Alan Moore deliberately tries to take these archetypes of popular superheroes and explain why in the real world they are flawed or assholes. Because effectively, pretty much anyone in the original Watchmen is either they're unlikable for various like reasons. Even the more benevolent characters like Night Owl, he's a sad sack. Like there are still qualities about him that while he's harmless, he's pathetic.
Mm.
In this HBO show, however, I think your referencing of Hooded Justice as being kind of a Superman allegory is appropriate, because Superman is a character that is you root for the character because of their cause, and that's born in both characters. Hooded Justice is an oppressed champion of marginalized and maligned people, and in this country have been for centuries. Whereas in the roots of Superman, it's the champion of an oppressed socioeconomic class. And so when you have characters with such a noble cause, it is someone that you actually can root for. Like I don't. While Hooded Justice is flawed in his family tree and the complications that delineate from that, as a concept, he's a champion of an abstraction. He's like that in the movie The Dark Knight. The whole he's a symbol.
I feel like he's like the embodiment of righteous anger. You know,
Yes.
like because to your point, like he is a flawed person. You know, he was a very angry man, and he like got lost in his rage. But like you can't at all blame him. His life has been defined by trauma and oppression and having to lie about who he is. You know, and I think Sean, you called that out in the in We Watched Watchmen, where it's like his entire life is defined by lying to himself and others about who he is. You know, and like that, you know, all of those things. How could that not produce somebody who's angry? You know, like you get it. You know, like and you root for him because you know you want to see him in some like you know in some way feel like he sees justice, you know, and whether that's you know whatever the cost of that may be. But like I don't think to Sean's point, like I think he is one of the few characters who you can look at that isn't compromised in that way that you called out, Phil, where it's like he's not a bad person. He's done bad things, but they're to good ends to bad people. So you give him a pass. And the one real character flaw that he has is a necessary defining trait of who he is and what he's experienced.
Yeah, and I would also argue that his anger is not it isn't a flaw in the sense that it burns away everything around him.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could argue that it damaged his relationship with his family, but that was already damaged because his relationship with June is based on a lie because he's gay and he's not telling her. So there's that. But that was a very different time where if he had said that or if he was open with that, that's a whole host of other issues, which is another thing that makes that character so amazing. But I think I disagree with the premise that the show is trying to say that hero worship is bad because he himself is inspired by Bass Reeves, who was also a hero, but a hero in cinema. And if it wasn't for Bass Reeves, Will Reeves never exists. And if Will Reeves never exists, so on and so forth. We understand.
To respond to that, I agree with you, but I think what Watchmen does to that point, or to a point that Phil made earlier, is it's looking at those archetypes as real people. And I think it's not that hero worship is bad, that him looking up to a fictional character who is an idealized moral character in the way that Superman is, that's not bad. But that's because Superman's not a real person. And behind the scenes, Superman isn't a murderer or a rapist or any of the things that we know almost all of the Watchmen or Minutemen to be. And that's more, I guess the point I was trying to make there is that I think it says that putting people on a pedestal is bad. Worshiping real people because we're all flawed in some way or another,
I disagree because I think Hooded Justice is an inspiration and he is looked up to, and it's with good reason because even though he's a murderer, he lives in the real world where he had to do those things, and it doesn't make him not a good person.
Well,
Hooded Justice is Will Reeves isn't. The idea of the same, similar to the idea of Superman versus Clark Kent. It's the idea of Hooded Justice going out and doing a thing and being devoted to an idea, whereas Will Reeves is the complicated person behind all that.
Right. Yeah, and I wouldn't even say that the value judgment that I'm making is about the murder or anything like that. It's to the point you made earlier, and this is going way back. You called out that his anger severs his relationship with his family, and it also it causes them pain, and that is to the point you made earlier. It's whether or not he's doing it for a greater good. There's an element of selfishness there because he's hurting other people to do that. He's hurting people he cares about. Whether his relationship's built on a lie or not, I think, it's clear that he cares about his family and the fact that his relationship to them was severed by his actions as Hooded Justice, even if they are just. He's a complex. I agree with you that he's overall his actions are more good than bad, but I think that doesn't make him not complicated or flawed.
I disagree, but we can move on.
Okay.
So Lady True is a character who is a legacy character. She's the daughter of Ozymandias, the unwitting daughter.
I have never given myself to a woman.
And she has a plan to save humanity. Her plan involves not getting Dr. Manhattan to help out and not some weird, hackneyed scheme, but she just straight up wants to be him. She wants to become Dr. Manhattan. And there's a few thoughts that I have within that. One is, and this is just a question, do you think that if she gets the power, she does what she says she would? And do you think that's ultimately better for humanity?
No, she's a god. She just converts and elevates, and she gets just as bored as John, just as disinterested, and she spins off into her own thing. I think her human intentions can try to get her there, but when she quote unquote elevates, nah.
I see. I agree with you, but I disagree that that's what would happen, because I think that the reason that John elevates and goes and fucks off and becomes disinterested in humanity is because he was a man of science, and I think that I totally agree with Ozzy's interpretation of her character, in that, like, any human who seeks to attain the power of a god would be a nasty, vengeful god, I think.
She's a woman of science too, in fairness.
Yeah.
The way
Oh,
she
yeah.
made all her trillions was in like the medical field, pharmaceuticals and stuff.
Fair. I didn't mean to equate that she wasn't as intelligent. She's more intelligent than John was before he became Dr. Manhattan, without question. But I mean, like, her primary goal is and through science, is the attaining of power and the consolidation of power to meet her ends, which she claims are the betterment of the world and the inevitable, like, creating peace and ending world hunger and all these very altruistic goals. But you can also argue that if those were her goals, she's already a genius and a billionaire, and she's not doing any of those things at all right now. Her goal is to attain godhood, ostensibly for that. But I don't think I would argue that that's what her actual goal is. It's power. It's ascending. It's ruling.
My only pushback on that would be that those are human goals, and John is not a human. That power is not human, and those are human thoughts, and that's not comparable to, you can see the fucking quirks on the floor. Like, that becomes so much more important and fundamental to reality than anything else someone might be feeling, because you can live on infinitely and experience infinite whatever. You are but 0.01 whatever the fuck percentage of a fuck.
To that point, I think she accomplishes her to-do list, for like whatever her immediate to-do list is: wipe out nuclear weapons, blah blah blah, kill all the racists, blah blah blah. And then she becomes disinterested and becomes a god, whatever that entails.
I think it's more nuanced than that. I think a thing that's kind of lost in Watchmen is that people have described Dr. Manhattan as his ascension is the result of his apathy, and I don't think it's that one for one. I think John, when he becomes ascended, is still like a puppet of the U.S. government in Watchmen. He wipes out and ends the Vietnam War at the behest of the American government, which is a very complex human thing to do.
It's a very puppet thing to do.
Yeah, sure. A lot of people, are puppets or whatever. But I think of the ending of All-Star Superman, where I feel like a comparable character is Lex Luthor, where she has the resources, trillions of dollars, to do a lot of these things as is, and she chooses not to. And in the end of that book, Lex Luthor is able to see things in the way that Superman is able to, and Superman makes the point that you could have done all this and chose not to. And that's what this is. This is a character who chooses not to use the resources she has because she has visions of grandeur.
But to that, the reason John is a puppet is because he's allowed to do his experiments. He's allowed to facilitate and continue to learn and to continue to do the things that do interest him. Murdering people doesn't care. We see that when a comedian shoots that woman, he does nothing, and he does similar things in other scenarios.
He ends up performing experiments regardless. Anyway, obviously he fucks off.
Yeah,
still does his shit.
To the point about Lady True, I actually feel like whether or not she is an egotistical megalomaniac is not the central factor as to why she does nothing with her trillions. I actually think the reason she does nothing is because there's nothing to be done. That the show is saying that the only way to move forward is to address the fact that everyone is stuck, that the world basically stopped when Ozzy did what he did. And so there's nothing she could possibly do that would change that. Her mentality is, we got to get rid of world hunger. We got to get rid of, these missiles, because if we don't, as soon as we try to progress, we're going to just destroy ourselves and have all the same problems we've always had. And those problems cannot be taken care of and handled by her trillions. They can be handled by Dr. Manhattan. And the show, Watchmen, and Doomsday Clock all make the same point, that Dr. Manhattan sucks. That God, he's trash.
Yep.
And Lady True, as rich as she is, doesn't have the power to solve the world's problems. And I think that that's a really important message.
But she does develop like cloning stuff. She does develop like flight technology. I don't think that she necessarily doesn't try to advance something. I think, to your point, she just doesn't have all of the means to address the things that she actually cares about. She can tackle certain things within certain limitations, but in order to do it without having to worry about wealth and having to do like all the extra stuff needed in order to address those situations, whereas she can just do it with the snap of a finger, that I think is she's trying to like sort of shortcut her way there.
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying is, this is a woman who is goal driven.
Yes.
So she's gonna knock out this to-do list, snap of her fingers, and then whatever.
They did such a good job of introducing her character. She puts down an hourglass, 3 minutes with this couple, and she gets exactly what she wants in 3 minutes in a very sensitive subject.
Yep.
That sets the entire tone for the character for the rest of 6 episodes or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't agree with Marco on a moral level about how he feels about her, but she's certainly a very compelling character.
That's Marco's waifu.
Marco is Lady True.
If Marco was a trillionaire, probably.
What do you guys think about that, though? The idea that in both alternative futures, Dr. Manhattan is viewed as trash at what he does. He's kind of like the opposite of Spider-Man, where Spider-Man learns this lesson of like, with great power comes great responsibility. And he's like, with all power comes no responsibility. I just don't care. I'm not going to involve myself. Why do you think it is that both futures make it a point to not only kill him, and I guess it's debatable in HBO's Watchmen, but, for the sake of what I'm trying to say right now, give the power away to someone else?
I think one thing that's interesting is in Doomsday Clock, the way we really see John experiment. And we see that to a degree in HBO's Watchmen, but with the issue in Doomsday Clock about Carver Coleman and that relation to Superman, how, as Pete stated earlier, as a man of science, he plucks things out of existence and then puts them back, and then pushes things a certain way or pushes it back. And I think as a man of science, that's John Osterman still just kind of trying to figure out how things are. And that carries over through Dr. Manhattan, and what that ends up being is inaction. And I think what's interesting about both versions is the idea that action is what's needed, not experimenting, but doing something, making something happen, finding a catalyst and continuing with the experiment, as it were.
I think to build on that point too, I think the reason that people's perception of Dr. Manhattan is that he's an asshole is because he ultimately is. You know, and in our Watchmen book, we talked about how I definitely think of him as a tragic character, and I have empathy for his struggle to adapt to his situation. But that being said, he says that things are inevitable and he can't be an actor because of fate and everything, but he absolutely is an actor. He makes tons of actions. And like him ending the Vietnam War is an action. That's him affecting fate and him playing a role in the world because of some misplaced sense of, you know, he says, I was trying to be a hero. I was trying to be, you know, there's a specific conversation that John in the show calls out all those things he was trying to achieve at other people's whims, right? And his inaction is refusing to make choices, but he still does things all the time. He makes plenty of choices. He decides whether he's going to act on someone's orders or not act on someone's orders. He decides to conduct his experiments or not conduct those experiments. Like, he is an actor as much as he wants to act like he's not. And I think Hooded Justice calls it out in the final episode of the show where he says, you know, for what he was, he could have done more.
See, I think I understand why you look at it that way, but at least the way I look at it, Dr. Manhattan is still a puppet just like everyone else. He just can see the strings. He's aware of the fact that there's a almost preordained nature to life, and he has to live on that track just like the rest of us do, but he lives through it all the time.
Right.
So when he's acting, he's only acting because it's what he did, what happened, not what he's choosing to do in this particular moment. And the show, I think, and I want to get your guys' feedback on this as well, I feel like the show is the best representation of the way that Dr. Manhattan's the way he experiences time, because he says long story short, basically he can't influence things, he can only live through things. So for example, when he walks into the bar and he tells Angela, oh yeah, you know, I want to go on a date with you, you're gonna go on a date with me tomorrow because I love you. And she's like, no. And he's like, well, your parents died, and that's why you're here. It's the anniversary. And then in 20, she's like, well, how do you know that? He's like, well, in 20 minutes, you're going to tell me. 20 minutes pass. She tells him, and he's like, I'm sorry, your parents died. And he has this very real reaction.
Yeah.
But it's because he knows that happened, but there's a difference for him between knowing the thing and then actually like living through the thing. He can't change what happens. He can't alter that, but he's aware of it at all times.
Getting the context of it in the moment.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
So
in the experience, because he lives in a deterministic, I wouldn't say preordained, I would say deterministic world, and that's his reality. And because of that reality, based off of his transformation, he's just able to experience the determinism from start to end.
Where Doomsday Clock tries to make the assertion that he is narrow-minded in that he can actually open, like, because he believes he's predetermined in his life, he actually isn't seeing the web of possibilities of a non-predetermined life. That was kind of the last issue of Doomsday Clock.
Yeah, right, because he sees how the future is going to play out, and then Superman makes a choice that surprises him, you know, and that like makes him realize. But I mean, you can also argue a similar thing happens here with Ozzy and the development of the device in his life as Cal, you know. But it's weird because it's both but neither, because he has that whole period of time where in the way he experiences time that doesn't apply, but he still sees when he becomes himself. It's very complicated.
As Cal, he's not an asshole. He's a very supportive and good dude.
Yeah.
But that's because
also,
it's not him.
Yeah, as soon as he becomes him, he leaves another woman.
I think we disagreed on this on the show on the we watched Watchmen, but I
Also,
think it is
sorry.
him.
Also, drops a bunch of eggs on the floor, doesn't clean it up. Real asshole move.
He didn't do it. He didn't do it. She did it. She tossed.
She throws the eggs on the floor.
Yeah.
Remember, she grabs it. He's like,
No. Hey, listen. Hey, Marco. I don't remember.
but to your point, Phil, I think the show understands Dr. Manhattan better than Doomsday Clock, and that's why I think the end for Doomsday Clock isn't it doesn't feel like it has a synergy with the original Watchmen story for me, for his character.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring this up at some point. Phil said it in our last Doomsday Clock review. He said that, like, at the end of the day, this is a Superman story that uses Watchmen to make its point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that's the major juxtaposition in my mind, is that I think maybe on like a technical level, you know, like particularly in the art, Doomsday Clock might feel more like Watchmen at times, but I think that the HBO show is a Watchmen story in a way that Doomsday Clock isn't, and I think that Damon definitely and the team obviously, but I think he gets Watchmen in a real fundamental way.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, and I don't disagree with the Doomsday Clock point. I think that's true.
It was your point, so I would hope not.
Well, you'd be surprised how often I contradict myself.
He's just like, that's bullshit. I don't agree with that.
To quote Phil in the last episode, "You made him fucking spit out his drink."
Oh, man.
You weren't ready for that one.
That's funny.
I don't know if I feel like he understands the source material fundamentally. I still at times sort of feel like characters like Adrian Veidt and Manhattan are kind of tacked on to I feel like this is a more intimate story about an abstraction of American history in the same way Watchmen is. But when I think it actually comes time to utilize characters from that book, I still kind of feel like they're sort of tacked on. Not all of them. Like, I think Laurie feels like she fits in the story well, who we haven't talked a lot about yet, her utilization. But I feel like he understands the themes of Watchmen really well and made a spiritual successor to that.
Let me ask you that. Do you guys feel like I lost it.
Oh man, second time this episode.
Man,
You gotta take your nostalgia pills, dude.
it was a good one. It was a good one. It was going to lead us down a whole fucking trail too.
What do you think about that?
Do you guys think that the show, that the plot of the show could have been done without the Watchmen characters and still have been a Watchmen story?
That's what I was thinking about after watching the show, and I feel like he could have probably told a very similar story without the Watchmen.
Shut up! I got it.
Okay.
Do you think that? So the reason that I think both of these stories succeed in telling their new characters in their new character stories.
Yes.
I think. Do you think that Ozymandias and Manhattan, they're like the driving narrative of Watchmen, like they're two stories.
Mm-hmm.
So with Phil saying that they feel tacked on to Watchmen, and I would even argue to a degree they feel tacked on to Doomsday Clock.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you think that that's why? Like maybe the new characters are what's driving this new thing forward and making that part successful, but not those parts?
I would respond to that by building on a point that Sean made earlier, where I think that the characters that are utilized the best in both works are the existing characters that were not very well developed. Because the legacy character that I think is used the best in this is Hooded Justice, who's a character that is mentioned really in name only in the original. And in Doomsday Clock, I thought Mothman was one of the most compelling usages of a legacy character, and I think again it's because as a Minuteman we don't know him very well, so you can build on him in a way where his legacy has impact, but it's not drudging up another character. But I would argue that I think that Ozzy's the amount of time spent on Ozzy's story, I agree leads to him feeling kind of tacked on. But I would argue that like Laurie is definitely well utilized. The imagery of Rorschach is well utilized in a similar way that Night Owl is well utilized. And I think it's those moments where the fact that those characters don't take up most of the air, they're more plot devices. Because even Dr. Manhattan, he's only relevant in the last 2 episodes, and I think that's to the story's benefit.
I was thinking about that too. And so the 2 characters that we get like a direct continuation of, other than Laurie, are Ozzy and Manhattan in both books. And they feel, to me at least, a little bit tacked on. But Rorschach is the other part of this kind of triangle. And in both books, the way that characters' values are interpreted and expressed are really interesting without Walter actually being in the book or in the show. So you have Reggie, who never even knew Walter, really taking up a mantle based on his perception of that person. And this, the works that have been published of Rorschach's journal have been interpreted in such a way by a fanatical cult of white supremacists that, again, it's not Walter, it's their interpretation. And so that bred 2 very interesting story and character directions for both works without actually having Walter ever be in either.
And to build on that, I would argue that the show uses those characters better and makes them feel less tacked on, because I remember one of the major gripes we had at the end of Doomsday Clock was that a lot of the Watchmen characters are not really actors. At least by the end of the story. In the grand scheme of things, like Ozzy scheming to get all those characters to the Watchmen universe, like, sets everything up, but the ultimate actors in the story are Dr. Manhattan and Superman.
So a lot has been said. When it comes to the Watchmen characters and their appearances in these 2 new stories, I think that I'm a little surprised that you guys feel that there was any amount of them being tacked on in HBO's Watchmen, because I thought that they were used very, very effectively. So Laurie is the most underutilized character in the original Watchmen, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And the show really redeems her in a lot of ways. It makes her a person who makes decisions, who has likes and dislikes, and she is the person who carries over the values, maybe that's not the right word, but the
legacy
of Watchmen the most. Mm-hmm. She is very cynical. She doesn't have time for bullshit. She's not about the masks anymore. She's not with any of that. And she constantly pokes and prods at people who are involved in hero worship. She's not interested in it. She is the Alan Moore carryover in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I thought that was an incredible use of a character who was this who was this blank slate, because Alan didn't do much with her to begin with. And this is 30 years later, she was the youngest character, the most room to grow. So I'm so glad that of all the Watchmen characters who got carried over, she was the one that they spent the most time with. When it comes to Dr. Manhattan, his fingerprints are all over the story before he makes an actual appearance, because of the fact that his existence changed the world so much. That is really the thing that differentiates our real world from the Watchmen world in the comic, is that they have Dr. Manhattan and we don't. That's the biggest difference. And so it stands to reason that his impact on the world would not have been erased 30 years later just because he's not around. That's a crazy thing to have happened, right?
Sure.
And so when he finally does appear, I think that it actually adds a whole new wrinkle to the show and to what the show is trying to say, because now you have to evaluate the show's cultural commentary while you deal with the fact that there's a God, that there's a real God. And if there is a real God, why the hell does this kind of stuff still have to be dealt with? Why is it that a regular ass black dude whose family and everyone he ever knew was obliterated 100 years ago still has to try to be the one to stop racism when there's a God who could just erase it, who could just stop it? You have to now be confronted with that. So it's not so much what he does or doesn't do, it's what he represents for the rest of the show and what it's trying to say. And that's an extremely effective use for a character, him and Ozzy, whose stories are already over. Yes. The Watchmen comic book ends their stories. It doesn't matter what Dr. Manhattan does after the story. It doesn't matter what Ozzy does after the story. So to bring them into the show and make them these major players would have actually felt weird because there's nothing more to say. So the way they are used, I thought, was totally effective.
Like, and to that point, like, I think that Ozzy's most significant contribution is the legacy of his actions and the fact that because of him, Lady True exists, you know? Like, he's most important in relation to her.
I think that's a good point of why I delineate a little bit, because you're right. Watchmen, and this is what's so challenging about telling stories with characters whose story arcs end with the original source material. Whether it's like the original Star Wars trilogy and trying to make a new series with characters whose stories are over, or this, or anything of that nature. Going into this, the challenge clearly was, and ditto for Doomsday Clock, is what do you do with characters whose stories have been resolved? And when their actions are the impetus for this, when their actions from the original source material are the impetus of what happens in Doomsday Clock and in Watchmen, the TV show, that is enough, I think, of an inciting incident for something. But when you have to include those characters as actors as well, that's the challenge. And because their story is over, that's why I think their impact is less meaningful than all the characters who stories weren't resolved or are new characters altogether.
But it's supposed to be that way, I think. They're not supposed to have the same impact because they're not the main characters, and I would argue that they're not really actors. The only reason I would argue that Ozzy feels tacked on at all is because of how much time we spend on him being trapped, you know, and that doesn't ultimately matter. What matters is when he returns and the very small role he plays at the end, you know, like, and I think you should feel that way. And the reason that Lori works so well is because the resolution of her storyline in Watchmen is that she is struggling with the end of a chapter of her life. Yeah. And where we meet her, she's established in the next chapter.
Yeah. Marco, what's your take?
I was going to make the analogy between the two new characters, or the new characters that we have, and the utilization, because I agree that the two biggest ones, Ozymandias and Dr. Manhattan, they only appear for, well, Dr. Manhattan at least appears for a short amount of time and is actually an actor for only a short period, and in both series, in the sense that ultimately other characters around them really decide the fate of the story. And while we have these new characters, their utilization is best, I think, represented in the show compared to the book, or compared to Doomsday Clock, at least. I mean, that was just the thought going through my mind while you guys were talking about it.
So I think it's interesting in the case of Dr. Manhattan specifically. the way that he's used across both these splinter timelines. Because in HBO's Watchmen, the biggest problem, the only problem that I had with that character was how weak he was. He doesn't he doesn't he can't stop the 7th Cavalry from, capturing him, and he can't stop Lady True from killing him. And even with him being this passive god who doesn't ever take action, Doomsday Clock and Watchmen both show us that he would not allow himself to be taken out like that. On Mars, when he's confronted by the Justice League, he just like lets them do whatever they're going to do, and they try, and they obviously fail very mightily to kill him. And then he's just like, all right, whatever, I'm done with this. But they can't really destroy him. And yet in HBO's Watchmen, regular ass people are able to take him down. But the consequence of Doomsday Clock presenting him in all his glory is that he actually is ultimately the only character whose decision making matters, because he's the one who alters the timeline to disrupt the lives of all these heroes. He's the one who erases the Justice Society and thus altering Superman's trajectory. He kills Superman's parents. He does all these things. That's what sets them on this course in for rebirth. But then he also decides, all right, maybe I don't want to subject them to this. I'm going to roll this back. And that's it. And it's rolled back. So how effective was Johns really in developing a story that furthered the narrative for all these characters, when ultimately Dr. Manhattan does something that he never has done before in Watchmen or HBO's Watchmen, where he actually just is a Deus Ex Machina. I think the point Alan Moore was going for was to not do that.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
Jeff Johns explicitly missed that point, in my opinion. Maybe he was making a point by changing that because of how important Superman was. You can make that argument, but I think just analyzing Dr. Manhattan as a character across all these media, that's not something that's consistent with the character, in my opinion.
I agree with that. That was, upon rereading it, was my issue, because again, the way that the show represents Dr. Manhattan, I think is more accurate in that he's passive. He lives in a deterministic world where he wouldn't go off and affect these things, because he doesn't care. As much as he can toy with these things, it doesn't matter. He's not preordained to do these things, and upon doing those things, it sets off new timelines, which inherently in his world, in his perception, that doesn't exist.
Right.
That's an impossibility, because it's just not reality to him. And I and that's why I think I like the show and the representation of that character a little bit more. And it goes back to what Phil says. It's a Superman comic. In Superman's world, you can do that. In comics, you can do that. And that was my biggest frustration. I remember when we reviewed Doomsday 12, my biggest criticism was that it just circled back on itself, and time doesn't do that. Time doesn't do that. It continues forward. It creates a lasting ripple, and that is something that the show succeeds incredibly in. Whereas the comic, it goes back because you make an allusion to editorial, you make whatever symbolism to comics as a whole, but that's not the Watchmen story. Watchmen isn't that kind of a comic. It's not that kind of a superhero story. And to that, I agree, Sean. I think he missed the point. Johns.
I think Johns puts Superman over and puts this editorial choice that needs to happen with restructuring the universe over at the expense of Dr. Manhattan.
I would agree with that.
And go ahead, Phil.
It's a weird reconstruction of a deconstruction.
Yeah.
And I think to Sean's point, I think you can make the argument that it makes sense given the fact that he is a character with a linear mindset who goes to a world that isn't linear, and how does that impact him and everything, and fair enough. But I think it's ultimately not that satisfying, because of what it changes about Dr. Manhattan, and more to Sean's point about it using him as a Deus Ex Machina and making it so that at the end of the day, the last issue or the last 2 issues of Doomsday Clock are the only ones that really matter. They're the only ones where any like you can look at and all of the stuff that happens before, like all of Ozzy's actions, all of Rorschach Second's actions, like Mime and Marionette, like none of those characters matter at all. You know?
And it sucks because they're all actually really great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they are. And those issues about them are great.
When
You know, you can argue the journey's worth the destination, but when you compare those characters to characters like Angela or Lady True, they don't measure up because they don't have complete arcs and their actions don't matter and they don't really grow or change like as much as they should. Whereas like Angela is a fantastic leading character, and she's compelling, and her actions totally matter because her relationship to her grandfather and how that ties to the legacy of superheroes to where they are right now, and how her relationship to Dr. Manhattan is the conduit that sets everything in motion. All of her actions matter, the entire story. And in the same way that like Lady True is a phenomenal antagonist, you know, and she is an actor. She orchestrates everything, you know, and even Looking Glass, who is by comparison a minor character, he's an actor, and his actions matter, and he has an arc that means something. You see where he starts and how he like overcomes his trauma, you know, like and you can't say that about any of the Doomsday Clock characters. As much as they're great and likable, they ultimately don't matter and they don't go anywhere.
I think the only one you could argue for, I would argue for, is Reggie, because he does have a clear arc and does get what he needs to get in the end. And I think that a part of why those other characters are less successful is because it's a comic and there's less space. And, you know, I would be really interested to see what John's follow-up for Doomsday Clock looks like without any DC characters at all. What would it look like if he didn't have, and this was his choice, it's not like he was mandated to include them, but I wonder what he would have done if he didn't include any of that other stuff at all.
Dr. Manhattan's only purpose in the TV show was to create life for Ozymandias to kill over and over again.
You lost me there.
Well, and to die.
And to die. No, I was trying to make a dumb joke.
Okay.
Because he created life.
Oh, right. Got it.
But it was just for Ozzy to kill repeatedly over and over.
Yeah.
Just like Phil in this joke.
Yep. Sure did, folks.
There you go. Well, much like John's there, you put Kale over at the expense of yourself. So there you go.
John's does that to Kale. You're right.
So when it comes to Ozzy, and, you know, as we get closer to wrapping up here, I feel like he fares a little bit better in the comparison between Doomsday Clock and HBO's Watchmen. I do feel like he's a more consistent character. But in rereading Doomsday Clock, one of the biggest issues that I had was and please correct me if you got it better, but I don't really understand what the hell he thought he was going to do. Because
especially in the second half of his plan.
Yeah, if Johnny Thunder, who Ozzy didn't know about, right? If he doesn't find the lantern, then Ozzy can't summon Dr. Manhattan. He needed the lantern and he needed Comedian. And he didn't know Comedian was alive. So what was the game plan once he gets to the DC world? I don't really understand that.
Sorry, were you finished?
Sure.
My understanding was his goal was to use Bubastis as a compass to find traces of Manhattan, which would have led him to the Lantern. All those other characters aside, and the DC characters aside, I mean,
and okay, But it's like if Johnny Thunder doesn't get the lantern, right? Where the hell is Ozzy getting the lantern? You know, it didn't feel tight. It feels
Half
convenient.
baked.
I don't think they're related, and I think that's why it's a bit frustrating. Because I think the idea is that Ozzy would have found the lantern with Bubastis, whether Johnny Thunder was there or not.
Maybe.
And like that was like we see that as like the first step of his plan, but like that may have been the entirety of his plan. Like
Because at that point, why even go see Lex Luthor? It was just like really like you're doing a lot of nothing, and then you get lucky. That's how I saw it.
No, I think you're right, Sean. Like I think that makes his characterization in Doomsday Clock by the end of it feel inconsistent because like he is the man with a plan, you know, like that's his whole thing is scheming. And you know, they make a huge point in the show of being like he records a video to send to Robert Redford like what 9 years or something before he gets elected, and he's like, how could I have predicted this with such incredible accuracy? I didn't. I orchestrated it all. And you're telling me that his plan is to get there, and he's like, I'm pretty sure I'll figure it out. You know, it's like that's not Ozzy.
That's a Phil plan. Oh, let's get in the car and we'll see where we go.
It's like a Phil joke.
Yeah, that is unfortunately very true.
There's that moment in the original Watchmen where, you know, everyone's like, oh man, when Ozzy tells them their plan and he's like, all right, well, or they're like, all right, well, we're just going to stop you. And he's like, stop me. You think I left room for that? Like,
yeah, it's already over.
He's so strategic and meticulous that it's hard for me to believe that he would have left the kind of holes that were in the book that needed to be filled by other characters' actions.
Like, think about how much thought he puts into like his plan to escape the prison, and you're telling me that he wouldn't put like that much thought into going to another universe and like, oh, what am I gonna do when I get there? How like it feels very half baked for a character that's all about the plan.
It feels like what Sean was saying about Dr. Manhattan being a passive and sort of ineffective in that he let regular people catch him and then Lady True kills him. That's sort of how Ozzy feels in Doomsday Clock. Just sort of impotent.
Well, to be fair to the show, they do express that because he gets his memories back, he has to like reset sort of what he's been experiencing. So they get him in a technically like in a weakened and non constituted state.
I like the way Manhattan was taken down. I think it makes a lot of sense. But Ozzy did not fare as well in Doomsday Clock.
Sure.
So I agree, Marco. The only problem I have is that he's clearly aware of what's about to happen, and in typical Dr. Manhattan fashion, he chooses to do nothing about it, and that's why I like it. Because if he chooses to do nothing, that means that he already knows that it's going to happen, and it is what it is, and I can accept that because that's his character. But what I couldn't accept would be, you know, oh, God, I'm disoriented and they got me somehow. You know, that for me that's silly for a god to be just taken down by some white thugs, some white supremacist thugs. I don't buy that.
Shoot him in the head with the bullets, it'll disorient him some more.
So yeah, I guess, you know, we're kind of rounding out the conversation here. And what do you ultimately feel about these two splinter timelines for the original Watchmen? Do you think, I mean, I think based on this conversation, it's pretty clear we probably favor the show in terms of being a successor, if you will. But do you think that they ultimately get the point? Do you think either one of them was, maybe necessary is not the right word, but worthy of what the original Watchmen laid down?
I think the show made me like Doomsday Clock less.
Aha! Remember when we said that? Kale and I said that shit,
Yeah.
and Marco too.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you guys. Like, I think that the things I like the most about Doomsday Clock are the execution of the first, probably like 9 or so issues. Like the craft that's put into it, I think is good. Like the fact that it ends on such a dud, like doesn't make the setup not enjoyable. Like the art is fantastic, and I think a lot of the plotting is clever, and it establishes new and interesting characters. It unfortunately, I think, fumbles the ball at the end, but to me, the thing that really makes HBO's Watchmen the more like quote unquote worthy successor or what have you is that I think it has a lot more to say, and I think it has a lot more to say about Watchmen, not Superman. And that's ultimately what sucks about Doomsday Clock, is that Doomsday Clock was billed as a Watchmen successor. It feels like a Watchmen successor, and then it kind of fakes you out at the end to be like, but here's some commentary that I have about Superman and the nature of comic books, and those are all things that are interesting. And like there are plenty of books that do that well, but I think to put Watchmen under to put that over is to the detriment of the overall series, and its package is lesser for it. Whereas HBO's Watchmen is it's truly a successor. It tries to pick up on the threads that can be picked up in ways that are, relevant to telling a new story for a new age and a new audience. And it's successful at doing that more than it isn't.
Yeah, I agree with you, Pete. And I'll answer the question in sort of in two ways. I think as a successor to the original graphic novel, I do think that I definitely agree with Pete that the show executes it a little bit better, has more to say, and I think understands the original text a bit more and can build off of that. Whereas Doomsday Clock, it again, I definitely agree. It started up the setup very, very well. It built up the drama. I was enthralled up until I would say like issue 11 even. There were just moments where there were tense moments, there were really action packed moments, and I had a good time reading it month to month. But then reading it,
Try again.
oh well, reading it issue by issue,
Year to
Fucking-
year.
Quarterly.
but reading it issue to issue, I do think that drama was there and worked very effectively. But reading it again as a collected issue back to back, as a collected piece back to back, there are definitely a couple flaws that you can sort of see, and that's how I answer your question in a different way. Is as a whole, by itself, excluding the Watchmen piece of it. Obviously, you need the context for it, but like as a unique piece of art, I do think that there are things about it that definitely shine. But it goes back to that last issue where it circles back on itself, and it tries to retain somewhat of a status, like a status quo, and that to me is always frustrating because for me, that kind of a comic book should have some sort of enduring, lasting impact. And if you bring it back to the conscience of Watchmen, it absolutely needs that, because that is an essence of that original piece of work. And I think as a whole, the Watchmen show is masterful in that, in standing by itself and standing not in the shadow, but standing next to that piece of work.
I feel like it makes Doomsday Clock look like a pastiche more than a proper follow up.
I think my thing about Doomsday Clock is it uses neat buzzwords like terrorism and weaponized phones, and it tries to feel relevant while using old Jeff Johns plots. The Black Adam Kondak superhero, worldwide superhero problem. That came. Sorry,
the Superman theory.
Yes, that came around in 52 and even before that. So it just, I don't know, reading it again, that all the cool Watchmen stuff, as we've said, to me was lost in all that. Like, it didn't feel, it felt like a Watchmen story being, I mean, as we've said throughout this, a Watchmen story being tacked on to DC events. And that's not, to me, I guess to me, that's not Watchmen. And I don't, in that effect, to me, that makes it a failure as a successor. But I find the TV show more interesting because it does really try to tackle something, and it really tries to tackle something that's real and tangible. And it does it well, for the most part. So yeah, I guess if we're gonna judge the worthiness scale, yeah, I sit on the TV show all day.
You can go ahead, Phil.
They're both pretty good. Not as good as the Watchmen book.
Okay.
Fair.
Yeah, I mean,
Was that up for debate or?
no, just thought,
I enjoy HBO's Watchmen more.
Really?
Out there.
Shit, I missed that question.
I feel like that's more interesting. You want to explain?
Sure. So I think that the original Watchmen is phenomenal. It misses the mark when it comes to social commentary. I don't really feel like it has a ton to say about people. It has a lot to say about, global politics and, war and heroes and masks and blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't really impact me on a level of talking about the things that I feel like need to be talked about. And so it has a lot of bite in other places, but in that specific place, it just wasn't working for me. And I understand why it's like that, because that's what the world was about. But I think that Alan Moore could have dug a little deeper, for me personally. And maybe there wasn't space. I get that. 12 issues is not a lot. And
those fucking scripts are packed to the gills.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not like maligning him for it, but that's just how I feel. Whereas the show, it takes what the original Watchmen did, and obviously I don't think the show functions without the original text, but it takes what the original book did, and it says, okay, cool. Well, there's all that, but then here's also this social commentary. Here's also these characters who feel very relevant today, right now. Whereas, I don't connect, and I don't know why anyone would really connect with anyone from the original Watchmen. And I get that you're not really supposed to, but it is what it is. And yeah, I just the new Watchmen, HBO's Watchmen, touched me and impacted me as a human being and taught me things about human beings in ways that the original Watchmen doesn't hold a candle to. And for me, when it comes to storytelling, that's more important.
Interesting.
I would push back a little bit on that, just in terms of to what I brought up like at the start, where in terms of scale, I think because the Watchmen show is at a much smaller scale, as much as it goes to Vietnam and does what it does, I do think that because of what it tries to address, which is the town of Tulsa, or the city of Tulsa, you have some more of that space, whereas the larger implications of Watchmen don't necessarily allow for some of the smaller aspects, because then you can say culturally race wars are cultural to an extent as well, and because you're focusing this larger piece, you can't touch upon a very specific kind of cultural or racial war.
Yeah, like I said, I understand why the original Watchmen is what it is, and I don't malign it, nor
Yeah,
do I
yeah,
think. Yeah, it's just at that point,
HBO spoke to
preference,
you
I
more.
guess.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Fair, fair.
I totally entertain that. I mean, I think it's definitely it's of relative quality. I think in its own medium, you know, where like it's definitely very well executed. You know, it's a high performing piece. You know, so yeah, I think that totally makes sense.
I would also make the argument that HBO's Watchmen is to the original Watchmen in originality in terms of the presentation of the work,
Mhm.
whereas Doomsday Clock is very much just trying to ape what the original work did.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like
Well,
it like when I said that it was like a pastiche, it feels almost like a study of what Watchmen is and how it works, you know? And like trying not necessarily just to replicate it, but like to say something about it through emulating it, you know? Like it feels almost like when you have like a musician or artist who like does uh like how Childish Gambino's last album was like an exploration of like a lot of like 70s like soul, and like it feels like it's like trying to say something by exploring a culturally relevant work, you know?
the thing that both Watchmen and HBO's Watchmen lacks, in my opinion, that Doomsday Clock has, is Dr. Manhattan telling Superman that nothing matters, and Superman saying, "Actually, it does."
So you never got to state your, your feelings.
Oh, those were his feelings. So wrap it up.
Third time's a charm.
Yeah. Okay. It's a feeling I have with a lot of kind of sequels and adaptations. The thing that works best about HBO's Watchmen and Doomsday Clock is when it was trying to do something different from the original Watchmen and trying to distance itself from characters and even themes that were prevalent in the original source material, because at the end of the day the original source material said what it had to say better than anything else could, because it's the thing that said it. And so when HBO's Watchmen um, was trying to create and craft a story about race in America in the lens of superhero stories, and that legacy, that was really distinct. That was something really fresh, and every angle that had to deal with Tulsa and and uh, Angela was very dynamic, and I think the themes that the show utilizes to tell that story are in vein with the original source material, and I think that's really effective. But when it really tries to start rooting itself in Watchmen stuff, it becomes less effective, because how it's I just think it's so challenging to try to take something that's already a perfect artifact and try to do something different with the things that were already done in that book. You know what I mean? And that's even more true in Doomsday Clock.
Yeah, I mean, Doomsday Clock doesn't really do anything new. You know, like
Yeah.
it to Sean's point, it tries to recapture the magic, and it does it to really no significant end. You know, whereas I think your mileage may have varied on some of its connections to the past, but I don't think you can argue that the HBO's Watchmen doesn't make good usage of its source material. Like it's informed by it in a way that is in its DNA, not just in the way that it tells a story, but also in the fact that it takes the history of that universe and allows it to inform the work. You know, and that's shown best through Hooded Justice and the episode that focuses on the Minutemen.
I don't agree with those points at all.
So for me, I think it's pretty clear based on what I've said that I feel like HBO's Watchmen is a successful successor. I think that it tries to be different and unique in the ways that the original Watchmen tried to be different and unique, but with a different take than the original had. And I think that that's very important. I think that Doomsday Clock had an opportunity to be similar because I feel the Superman theory stuff is really interesting in the sense that being able to look at DC's heroes through the lens of Watchmen is really compelling. Ozymandias' conversation with Batman, I thought, was really great.
Yeah.
Where he's kind of saying, like, wait a second, why are there so many of you? Why are your villains alive? What is this? Why are they in jail? Why are you still dealing with these people? No one really challenges the way that comics operate within the comics the way that Ozzy did, and I think only a character like Ozzy could do that way. And especially when you consider everything that was happening around them at the same time, where Batman has now become persecuted by the people and they don't want him anymore, and Wonder Woman has retreated. And I think that there were so many compelling things that could have led to a tremendous story that could have been a worthy successor, but it fails as soon as it forces these characters to play roles that they've already played and stops looking at them against each other. Whereas HBO's Watchmen is unburdened by having to address an entirely different cast of characters from a different universe who operate differently. Ultimately, though, I do think that both of them were worth having. I feel like both of them were worth making. I don't feel like either one of them shits on or steps on what Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons were trying to do originally. And even if Doomsday Clock doesn't succeed, I'm glad that they tried because it was an honest and earnest attempt and not a cash grab. And I'll never feel like that. I'll never feel like it was a cash grab. And I think Jeff Johns, flawed as it may be, really did do the best he could do to try to tell a story that was worth being told. And for that reason alone, and then you add on the quality, I'm very pleased and glad that it was made.
Yeah. You
And
know
to
what was
Marco's
a
point,
cash
it was
grab? This episode. Hey!
We're the before Watchmen, baby.
Oh God.
Sorry, Pete.
No, you're fine, man. I was just gonna build on your point and say that I think that the experience of Doomsday Clock was still enjoyable, even if the ending wasn't necessarily what we wanted or what we expected, But I think that's a major problem, honestly, with the way that we as a culture look at and experience art. Where if you enjoyed the journey, I agree with Sean. It was worth it. It was worth what we got out of it and the conversations it had us have about its relation to the original work, And I think there's value in that and in making the effort and then having the dialogue about how successful it was or wasn't.
Do you guys feel like Doomsday Clock and the original Watchmen were both lacking lube, man?
Yes. Oh my God.
I'm so glad that he got brought up.
All right, this is the last thing we're not even gonna talk about it. I'm just gonna tell you because you probably don't know, Pete and Phil, who that was. Do you know?
No.
Okay.
Oh yeah, it's got to be the only other tall, gangly man in the show, Laurie's sidekick.
Yep.
Yes, it was Petey.
Oh, I didn't think about that.
Didn't you edit those episodes?
Yeah, but I intentionally, the way I edited it was trying to avoid spoilers, so I looked for gaps and noise that I needed to cut out, so I skimmed some stuff. And when you guys started talking about Lube Man, I was like, I don't want to know who he is.
Yeah, so for those of you who
That's
were
funny.
curious, Lube Man is Petey, and he's no longer an FBI agent. He got fired.
And he is the best character in Doomsday.
That is the true end of Watchmen, by the way. And also, he's not the best character in Doomsday Clock.
Did he?
He sure is.
Did he die in the squid rain, or is he's out there being?
Nah, he's at large. That's what season 2 is going to be about.
Hell
Lube Men
yeah.
at large.
Yo.
What with the fog dancer?
Fog dancer, yeah.
Yeah.
That was his.
That's
Yes.
well. That's fog dancers are people who go to the site of a battle or like a situation in war and like clean up the mess.
Okay.
So we don't know what mess exactly he was cleaning up, but he was involved with something. And then, of course, another hint is the fact that he is present at the site of Looking Glass having murdered all the 7th Cavalry members who went to his house.
Sure.
He's definitely not cleaning up the lube.
He's using the lube. So that's going to do it for our conversation about Watchmen, this Watchmen retrospective. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Obviously, there's so much to be said about Watchmen, and I think I speak for the pals when I say that we're really happy that we got so much awesome Watchmen content because we're happy with the original, but these things added a lot of layers and dimensions that can actually enhance your reading of the original, especially in the case of HBO's Watchmen, because it adds things that you can see how they could have been extrapolated from the original, like how like what happens with Hooded Justice. So let us know your thoughts about these 3 pieces of media, even if you want to talk to us about before Watchmen. Whatever you have to say about Watchmen, we're definitely interested in hearing about it. Obviously, we're going to take a little bit of a Watchmen break because we have talked a lot about it. But that doesn't mean that we're not willing to engage in conversation about it going forward. I do want to let you guys know we have a Discord server. You can continue the conversation with us there. You can find a link to our Discord server in the description below. Wherever it is that you are listening to us, it will be there. And, of course, links to everything else that we do will be in the description. Thank you guys so much for listening. And until next time, take care, guys.
See you next time.
Goodbye. I ended this podcast 35 minutes ago.
You did that.
Get the hell out of here.